Hey everybody, it's Lon.TV, and I got my Sega Genesis out once again because we just got in a new flash cartridge from Krikzz. This is the Mega Everdrive Pro, and what this lets you do is load up a bunch of games on an SD card and play them on your original Sega hardware. And what's cool about this new flash cartridge is that it also can replicate the Sega CD, so you can play Sega CD games on the cartridge without the need for a Sega CD unit. And we're going to be taking a closer look at this device and what it can do here in just a second. But I do want to let you know, in the interest of full disclosure, that this came in free of charge from Krikzz. However, all the opinions you're about to hear are my own. Nobody is paying for this review, nor is anyone reviewing or approving what you're about to see before it was uploaded. So let's get into it now and see what this cartridge is all about. So let's take a closer look now at the hardware. It is just a basic cartridge device that pops right into your Sega Genesis, as any cartridge would. It is compatible with the original Sega hardware like we've got here. It also works with the awesome analog Mega SG that we reviewed about a year ago. That's an FPGA-based replica of the original Sega hardware, and all of this stuff works with it just as well as it does on the original. Now, what's cool about these cartridges is that they give you the ability to play the complete Mega Drive and Genesis library on your device, irrespective of what region it came from. It also supports Mastersystem games because the Sega Genesis was backwards compatible with the Sega Master System as well. And of course, this cartridge adds in the ability to play the Sega CD stuff. Now, we also have to mention something we looked at not all that long ago, which is the Terraonion Mega SD. This is a competing device, and it does a lot of the same things. And as we work our way through the review, I'll talk about some of the things that the Mega Everdrive does differently. Now, it's important to note that any features that are different between these two devices now may not be different in the future, as software updates can come down to change how these devices operate. Both can take firmware updates, and I'm sure we'll see a bunch on the Mega Everdrive Pro as its life cycle develops. Now, the too long didn't read on this video is that if you have a Mega SD now, I think you'll be perfectly happy sticking with it. But if you don't have a Mega SD now, the Mega Everdrive Pro might be worth considering, given that it costs less, and that's something that might compel some people to go to the Mega Everdrive. There's about a $50 price difference between the two, with the Mega Everdrive coming in at around $200 and the Mega SD selling for about $250. Now, as far as the physical hardware is concerned, the Mega Everdrive Pro is smaller than the Mega SD physically. Not that that makes much of a difference, because they both fit into the console without issues. I do think they did a better job here on the SD card slot. It's easier to get the card in and out of it versus the Mega SD. You also get a USB port here for doing development work, so you can connect your computer up to the cartridge and feed new builds of your game to the console more efficiently than having to take the card out every time. So that might be a bonus for development folks out there. This button here is used to pause games when you're playing Master System titles. The old Master System required you to get up and actually push a button on the console to get the pause going, and that is replicated here with the cartridge. Now, before we boot up my Sega Genesis here, I did want to talk about the setup we're using today. I'm using something called a Retrotink 2X right here to get the video captured into my video system. This is a line doubler, and what it does is it takes analog signals from old game consoles and other devices, including like VCRs, and it will convert that video to 480p, which will work great on most modern displays. In fact, if you use a Retrotink device like this one, these old consoles will look better than they would if they were plugged directly into your television, just because this thing processes the video in such a way that reduces lag and gives you a very, very nice output. In fact, the device itself doesn't add any lag at all. Now, connected to the Retrotink is an HD retrovision cable that plugs into the back of my Sega Genesis here. One of the things that I love about the Sega Genesis is that it will output RGB without any modifications, and this will give you the best image quality for a modern TV or capture device. These cables aren't cheap, but they do deliver some really spectacular results. But again, you could use the composite input as well, and it would still look pretty decent. I did a review of this whole setup here a while back, which I'll link to down below in the video description. All right, without further ado, let's boot this thing up and see what happens. It actually boots up very quickly. If you have the Model 2 like I have, you'll get that licensing menu there, and then you'll be brought to the main menu. One thing to just remind you about is that this really requires original Sega hardware or something that is super compatible with original Sega hardware like the Mega SG. Most of the clone consoles out there won't work with this, so you'll need to do some research to make sure that this is compatible with a console that you might have. But again, if you got the Mega SG or the original Sega hardware, you are good to go. Now, before I started shooting, I loaded up some games here in the Games folder. They also have you download a folder here called Mega, which is the software that the cartridge runs to get all of its stuff going. But you'll want to keep your games in the Games folder here. I'm just going to jump into my demo folder real quick, and I've got a couple of cartridges already set to go here. So one of the ones that I like to test is Sonic the Hedgehog 3, which was a later release in the Genesis library. And I can just go here and hit Start, and that will bring us right into the game. I can even bring the sound up here if you want to hear some audio from the Sega Genesis. There we go. All is good. And we can start playing the game and have at it. Pretty cool stuff. You can see also that it retained my save games. So if you have games like this one that support saves, it will save it to the card's backup RAM, and then it will write it back out to the card as well. So you'll have a backup essentially always at the ready. And you can see just how quickly everything came up here, and that is pretty much it. Now, when you're playing a Sega Genesis game like this, you can bring up an on-screen menu. By default, it is at Down and Start, and that will give you some options that you can pursue while you're in the game. So for example, I could set a save state, and what this is something that will save the position of the game when you execute it. And you have 100 different save slots here that you can use for those save states. So you can really do a lot of different portions of the game that you can pretty much take a snapshot of as you go here. I already have one here at position 0, so if I go over here to load state, that will drop me off to that spot in the game where I last saved, and here I kind of saved it right before a boss battle, just in case I died. There's a lot of controversy about the use of save states, of course, so if you don't agree with them, don't use them, but you have that as an option, and as you can see here, I can just load that state again and go right back to where I left off. Also in here is a cheat menu, and you can set cheats that will basically replicate what you might remember from the Game Genie. And what's also neat about this, and this is something that the Mega SD also does, is that it will remember the cheats that you enter, so you don't have to put them in every time. And then you can choose to have them on or off here in the menu, which can be really helpful there. Beyond that, you can reset the game or exit the game to go back to the main menu. Now, if we wanted to load up a Mastersystem game, that is just as easy. I can just select Phantasy Star here, for example, and hit Start Game, and that will bring us into the Sega BIOS screen initially here, and then over to the game to get started. And that's just how easy it is to switch between the old 8-bit console and the 16-bit one. Now, one thing the Mega Everdrive does now with Sega Master System cartridges that the Mega SD does not do, but probably will do in the near future, is that you can bring up a menu within the Master System games. Right now I've got mine set to down, B, and C. And as you can see here, I can do save states, load states. I've got 99 save states here for the game, and I can pretty much do everything I can do in a Genesis game with this on-screen menu on the Master System side as well. And again, that's something that is not in the Mega SD at the moment. Now on the Mega SG, the Master System in-game menu does not appear to work. There is a very helpful documentation file on Krikzz's website where he's got a bunch of limitations that you might see on some versions of the Genesis hardware as well. And I would definitely suggest you take a look at this document prior to purchasing just to make sure all of your expectations will be met. Now, of course, the big new feature on the Mega Everdrive Pro is its Sega CD support. Prior versions of the Mega Everdrive did not support the CD, and like the Mega SD, it'll run the Sega CD games through the cartridge itself, which I think is totally awesome, given that the original Sega CD had to be plugged into the side of the console. Now, in order to get the CD games to work, you do need to load up BIOS files on your SD card. I have a US BIOS and a Japanese BIOS on here, and depending on the game, the cartridge will figure out which BIOS to load first. So we're going to go here and load Sonic CD, the US version, and we'll just go here to Start Game. And what will happen here is it will boot up the US BIOS because it knows it's a US game. I'll hit Start here to get things going, and this very familiar sound and Sonic graphic here will appear, and within a few seconds the game will have booted up and we'll be able to not only hear the CD audio here, but also see the graphics, and we can get going with this Sega CD game, but on a single cartridge, which I think is great. And these will certainly load a little slower than they would off of a cartridge image, because it is basically replicating how a CD would be read. And as you can see here, the sound is great. You may not like the US version sound, but this was the one I remembered the most, and all seems to be working quite well here without a hitch. Let's take a look at another game. Now, you can't appreciate 90s CD-ROM video gaming without playing a few of these awful full-motion video games. This one is Tomcat Alley. The good news is that these games will run fine off the cartridge here, and as you can see, the video looks just as lousy as it did 20-something years ago. All right, here is Batman Returns, and I like to run this one just because it uses a lot of the hardware scaling that the Sega CD added to the mix. The Sega CD itself was kind of like a separate console because it added a second processor and, again, some of these hardware scaling effects that were not available on the original Sega Genesis. And as you can see here, everything is working just fine. Now, one thing to note when you're in Sega CD mode is that you don't get an on-screen menu. You also don't get save states due to the complexity of how all of this works. Now, additionally, the Sega 32X CD titles are not compatible with the Mega Everdrive Pro because it connects through the cartridge slot. I believe the Mega SD here had an adapter that allowed you to plug it into the side so that you could get those 32X CD games to load, but the Mega Everdrive Pro, at the moment at any rate, only works with the 16-bit games and not the 32-bit 32X titles. Now, the only gotcha with this cartridge versus the Mega SD is that the Mega Everdrive Pro is a little more finicky when it comes to CD image formats. And let me give you an example. I wanted to show how the cartridge in this review can differentiate between a Japanese title and an American title by loading the right BIOS. And I've got a copy of Sonic the Hedgehog CD from Japan. And if I go into it here, you can see the RIP that I've got has multiple tracks. It's not just a single bin file. It's got a bunch of bin files. And what I figured I would do is go to track 1 and load the game. But as you can see here, it gets confused and doesn't know what to do with it. I had a few other titles that were ripped in a way that was not just the standard bin queue format, and those titles didn't load either. So the games are compatible, but the CD format was not what the Mega Everdrive Pro was looking for. Now, in comparison, the Mega SD has been able to load up every image that I have in my repertoire without any issues. This one, again, is a little bit more specific about what it wants. So what I did to solve this problem was I burned that image back to a CD with IMG burn on Windows. And then after the CD was burned, I re-ripped it with IMG burn, and then I was able to get those files delivered down to a single bin file along with its associated queue file. And now I can load it up and get playing here. And I can even turn on the audio here in a second once the BIOS goes through. Now you can see here too that it loaded up the Japanese BIOS correctly because it was a Japanese game. And we'll let this thing do its thing, and sure enough, we will get Sonic the Hedgehog loaded up here after a little bit of extra work to get the right format for the cartridge, complete with the separate Japanese soundtrack here. So just keep in mind that you might have to re-rip some of your CD images, especially if you've got those multi-file images or a format that the cartridge doesn't like. That could be one area that Krikzz improves with a future firmware update, but at the moment you'll need to do a little bit of work on some of those CD images that are not compatible. One thing that I did notice, though, is that you can use cheats with the CD titles. Again, you don't get the save states or anything else like that, but you can put the Game Genie codes in here, and these will behave the same as they would on a cartridge in that it will save the code, and then you can decide to activate it or deactivate it in future runs of the game. Now I'm going to attach my 32X in a second, but I did want to load up Virtua Racing, which was a game on the Sega Genesis that had its own coprocessor on the cartridge. And as you can see here, that coprocessor is running on the Mega Everdrive Pro's FPGA, and you're getting all of the rudimentary 3D graphics that cartridge provided here with the Mega Everdrive. This also, by the way, works on the Mega SD. All right, so now we've got the Sega 32X attached, as you can see here, and we're going to load up the Star Wars arcade game that I bought with my 32X way back in the day. They were liquidating stuff. I got a great deal on my 32X back in 97 or 98. You can put cheats in here for these 32X games if you want, so that's an option that you can pursue, or you can just load the game. Now remember, you can't play the 32X CD titles, but the 32X games will run fine, provided you have a 32X attached. The Mega SD will also play 32X games, and we can just jump right in here and start playing. So all is good on the 32X front. Now when the 32X is attached, there are some limitations, and these limitations exist both on the Mega Everdrive Pro and the Mega SD. So the first one is that you can't run any of the Mastersystem games when the cartridge is on the 32X here, as you can see. And the 16-bit CD titles also will not run. So if I try to load this game up here, you can see that it's telling me the 32X is attached. But you can play regular Sega Genesis and Mega Drive games when the 32X is attached here. So there are some things you can do, but you don't get the in-game menu when the 32X is attached and you're playing Mega Drive games. Now there's one more library of games that this cartridge provides support for, and that is the NES. Yes, the Nintendo NES. You can load up your NES ROM files on the cartridge here, and it will load them. There's an actual NES core running on the cartridge right now. So it is essentially a Nintendo Entertainment System in a cartridge. And as you can see here, some of the earlier games work fine, like Super Mario Brothers. But take a look at Super Mario Brothers 3 that has a lot of mappers and other stuff that it uses. You can see the screen is kind of jumping around a bit. You'll also see some other graphical glitches here. So it's not going to be perfect NES emulation here by any stretch. It's just kind of a gee whiz feature that they were able to add. I just think it's really cool that it even works at all. And who knows if we'll see more improvements to this, but I did think it was kind of a fun party trick that you can surprise your friends with when they come over. All right, now I want to jump through a few of the options and other neat little features that I found on the cartridge that are of note. We're going to browse into the Mega folder here and go to Saves. And if you go to this folder called SMD Snap, this is the save state folder for the save states that we've been creating as we've been playing games. And earlier we had that one from Sonic the Hedgehog. You can see the file name here. And if I go to Preview, I get an actual image of what was happening in the game at the time that I took the save state. I thought that was really neat just to see what is there. What would be really cool is if I could load the game up from the file. I can't do that at the moment, but you can at least look at what the image was on screen when that state was saved, which I thought was pretty neat. Now to get to the configuration options, you hit the C button on your controller, and that will pull up your main menu. So the first thing that I often go to is the recently played menu here, because this is a way to get back to the game you were last playing very quickly. Keeps a pretty long list of what you were working on there. You can also access the cheats here as well. This will apply to the most recently loaded ROM. So it's probably easier to go to the game and select the cheat menu, but you can do it there. If you just want to run the Mega CD BIOS on its own, you can do that right over here by clicking Run Mega CD. This will give you some device info about what you've got installed. They also have some nice diagnostic tests here too, which checks out all of the different components of the card. It'll even do a speed test of your SD card that's in there as well, so that's pretty cool. If we go over to options here, you can see some of the other things that you can configure, so you can decide whether or not to have the in-game menu on. Mega Key is something unique to Krikzz cartridges. This is a way to bypass some of the region locks on the games that you might want to play. You can disable cheats globally here just by turning them off. You have the option to use a Sega Master System BIOS. You can switch it off if you don't need it. You do have to download that BIOS though and put it on the SD card. The SMS YM2413 was an FM synthesis chip that was on the Japanese version of the Sega Master System. What's really neat is that although it did not appear on the US Master System, a lot of the games that you got in the US had that FM audio embedded. The system just didn't have the chip to play back the audio. If you enable this, games that support it will sound very different. And it's kind of cool to hear your favorite old games with a different sound chip, so that's something you could work on. Reset to menu means that the system will reset to the cartridge menu when you hit the reset button. If you turn this off, I believe it will load the last game that you had in the system. File sorting is pretty self-explanatory. Warnings is self-explanatory. Mega CD options here will allow you to set some of the CD audio settings here. One of the things that I turned on that was off by default was the per game RAM cart. And what this will do is save a separate file for every CD game that you load on your cartridge here. That's a feature also on the Mega SD, but it's a way to kind of separate all your save game files into their own unique buckets. So that might be something you might want to turn on. Hide Q files just hides the Q file that you're browsing in the folder there. In-game combo allows you to set the different combos for pulling up the in-game menu. You can also save combos for doing save states and loads. So for example, I have a save state of down B and C. So if I hit down B and C at the same time on the controller, it will save a state. I could then configure my quick load to be up B and C, and that will lock in. And now when I'm in my cartridge games, I can very quickly load and save states if I want. So that's kind of a neat little thing there. RTC setup is just the real-time clock that's on the cartridge, and you can set your time in there with that. And a couple of other little odds and ends here of interest on the ROM here. Before you run it, you can get some more info on the ROM itself, the region, the size, the date, all that good stuff. You can also look at its hexadecimal data here, so you can dive into the ROM file itself and try to see what it's doing when it loads itself up. So that might be kind of fun to play around with a bit there. One other thing that's really cool is that if you take a bunch of cheat codes like I've got here and make a text file, you can speed up the entry of those cheat codes. So what I did here is I loaded up the Sonic the Hedgehog ROM and then backed out of it. And then if I go here to Sonic TXT, because it has a TXT extension, I can load these cheats into the Sonic the Hedgehog game without having to type them in with the controller. So I thought that was really useful, and I could decide to turn them on or off here as needed. So that's a cool little feature. And I can choose to apply those cheats here, and they'll be good to go. And then if I don't want that file on my SD card anymore, I can go down to Delete here and get rid of it. So that's going to do it for this look at the Mega Everdrive Pro, another solid offering from Krikzz. Very good integration with the Sega CD here, and I still think it's magic that you can get the CD games running through the cartridge slot. I don't know how these guys do this. And you might be wondering which of these two is better after watching this entire review. And it's hard to say because, to be honest with you, they both, for the most part, give you the same experience. There are some things that the Mega Everdrive Pro does a little better. It does load some of the cartridge games a little quicker, so if you want to save a few seconds here and there, this is probably the better way to go. You get the save states for the Sega Master System on compatible hardware. That's a nice addition. It also has more save state slots than the Mega SD does at the moment. You get the NES core, of course, and then if you are a developer, you've got the USB port on here. My only gripe at the moment with this, though, is that it's not as flexible with the CD images. So if you have a multi-file CD image at the moment, it doesn't load it up. You have to re-image it to get it to be compatible. Again, that's something that the Mega SD doesn't struggle with. But this one is a lot less expensive. You're going to pay about $50 or $60 less for this than you'll pay for this and get very similar functionality between the two of them. Ultimately, competition is good, even in a very niche market like flash cartridges for the Sega Genesis, and I'm very happy to see all of this development for this system because this was one of my favorite game systems when I was a kid, and it's awesome to still be exploring and getting new things for it. 30 years later as a middle-aged man. This is good stuff, and I'm very excited to have both of these things in the marketplace. And like I said, if you got this already, you don't need this. But if you're in the market, this is probably the better buy because it's less expensive. That's going to do it for now. Until next time, this is Lon.TV. Thanks for watching.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold level supporters Tom Albrecht, Chris Allegretta, David Hockman, Brian Parker, Mike Patterson, and Bill Pomerantz. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to lon.tv/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit lon.tv/s.